Welcome to the Baby Let's Talk podcast. My name is Ragna and I am your host. I am a medical doctor, a certified pre-postnatal trainer and a mother of 4, and I help moms reclaim their health and reach their goals through the power of movement, nutrition and overall healthy lifestyle. This podcast is born from my dedication to uncovering the truths about nutrition, exercise and lifestyle that genuinely benefit our bodies. We'll explore how to establish a lasting, healthy lifestyle that fits the reality of motherhood, how to enjoy an active, pain-free pregnancy, and how to navigate postpartum recovery to regain your fitness in a wholesome way. Join me as we debunk myths and discover the paths to excess energy, body confidence, and loving the life you live as a mom. Welcome to episode 2 of the Baby Let's Talk podcast. This is the first part in the blood sugar series. And in this episode, we will break down how eating different types of carbs affects our blood sugar and overall energy. And I'll explain how our bodies process everything from simple sugars to complex starches and fibers and how this influences our energy levels and health through storage and hormones. Now, we will get quite technical at times, but I will explain everything as well as I can for everyone to understand, no matter what your background is. So, one of the most important factors regarding our diet is what it does to our body. What happens inside our body after we have had a meal. How our body responds to the nutrients that come in. So, what happens when you eat a meal is that the food is broken down in your digestive system, and the nutrients from the food go into your bloodstream for your body to use as fuel for energy production and for building or repair, or it goes to storage. Now, all the cells in your body need energy to stay alive and function, like we talked about in our first episode, and glucose is the most important source of energy in all organisms. Glucose is a monosaccharide sugar molecule, and before we go any further, it is important to know the basics about sugars or carbohydrates. So here's a little lesson on this. So we have first monosaccharides, also called simple sugars. These are the simplest form of sugar or carbohydrates and the most basic units or monomers from which all carbohydrates are built. In other words, they are the structural units or building blocks of carbohydrates. Now, mono means single and saccharide means sugar, so the name monosaccharides means single sugars, which is very descriptive of their structure. They consist of only one molecule. And the 3 monosaccharide molecules that we have are glucose, fructose, and galactose. Then we have disaccharides, di meaning double, so they consist of 2 monosaccharides joined together. For example, sucrose or table sugar, which is composed of 1 glucose molecule and 1 fructose molecule, and lactose, which is known as milk sugar, which is composed of 1 glucose molecule and 1 galactose molecule. Then we have the polysaccharides, which consist of many monosaccharides joined together. Poly meaning many, so it's many sugars, and that is they are large complexes of monosaccharides that are joined together. Now, polysaccharides are also called polycarbohydrates or complex carbohydrates, and they are the most abundant carbohydrates that we find in food. They are long-chain polymeric carbohydrates composed of monosaccharide units that are bound together by glycosidic linkages. Now, polysaccharides are divided into storage polysaccharides, such as starch, glycogen, and galactogen, and structural polysaccharides, such as cellulose and chitin. And you've most likely heard of some of these polysaccharides before. For example, starch, which is polysaccharide of glucose, that is the storage form of glucose in plants. That is, plants make starch when they package glucose molecules more sufficiently together for storage and then store it away throughout the plant, but mostly in the roots. And then when the plant is in need for glucose, either for energy production or for building or repair, it can enter its storage and free up glucose molecules from the starchy chains and use it. Now, glycogen is a polysaccharide of glucose that serves as a form of energy storage in animals and fungi and bacteria. And this is the main storage form of glucose in the human body. And it is therefore sometimes called animal starch. Now, galactogen is the third type of storage polysaccharide, but it's not of our concern. It's something that only exists in snails. And then we have the two structural polysaccharides, cellulose and chitin. Cellulose is a structural polysaccharide primarily found in the cell walls of green plants and other organisms, and it is mainly used to produce paper, for example. And then chitin is a stronger structural polysaccharide than cellulose, which is found in arthropod exoskeletons and in the walls of some fungi as well. And is also used in, for example, surgical threads. Now, that's not of our concern. Now, the polysaccharides we'll only be talking about are glycogen and starch from now on. Then to make things a little bit more complicated, we also have oligosaccharides. And oligo means a few. So oligosaccharides are saccharide polymers, sugar polymers or sugar complexes that are constructed of a small number of monosaccharides. So typically 3 to 10 monosaccharides joined together. So by definition, polysaccharides are bigger than oligosaccharides containing more than 10 monosaccharide units. Now, we don't need to use much energy on learning this, but it's just good to have heard of these concepts before we go any further. Lastly, regarding carbohydrates, it's only fitting to have a short introduction on fiber. Dietary fiber is defined as plant components that are not broken down by human digestive enzymes. So fiber is constructed of monosaccharide molecules, but they are put together in a way that our digestive enzymes cannot break them down. And dietary fiber is found in, for example, fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. Cooked dry beans or legumes, they contain the highest fiber mass per serving, followed by then dark green vegetables, and then with a significantly lower amount of fiber mass is whole grains, orange vegetables, starchy vegetables, other vegetables, and fruit, and then in some part meat. Now, dietary fibers are important for our gut health, and they can change the nature of the contents of the gastrointestinal tract, and they can affect how other nutrients and chemicals are absorbed. And we will learn more about fiber in future episodes when we talk about gut health, but back to carbohydrates. You have probably heard the terms simple carbohydrates and complex carbohydrates before. This classification refers to the chemical structure of the carbohydrates, that is simple carbohydrates, called sugars, and these are the monosaccharides, the glucose, fructose, and galactose, and disaccharides, which is sucrose or table sugar, and lactose or milk sugar. And then we have the complex carbohydrates. These are the polysaccharides, or also oligosaccharides. Now, one thing that's important to mention here is that there does persist a small confusion in using these terms today. The term complex carbohydrates was first used in the dietary goals for the United States in 1977, where it was intended to distinguish sugars from other carbohydrates, which were perceived to be nutritionally superior. But the report placed fruit, vegetables, and whole grains in the complex carbohydrate column, despite the fact that these may contain sugars as well as polysaccharides. So they contain simple carbohydrates or sugars as well as complex carbohydrates. And this confusion persists as today, as many use the term complex carbohydrates to refer to any sort of digestible saccharide that is present in a whole food that contains also fiber, vitamins, and minerals, and as opposed to just processed carbohydrates, which provide energy but few other nutrients. So the correct usage of these terms is to classify carbohydrates chemically, and the simple versus complex chemical distinction has little value actually for determining the nutritional quality of carbohydrates. Now, understanding all of these terms is important in order to gain good understanding of how food affects our body. So when food that is rich in carbohydrates enters our digestive system starts breaking it down into its simplest form in order to take it up into the bloodstream or absorb it. And the simplest form of carbohydrates is glucose, also fructose and galactose, but glucose is the overall most abundant monosaccharide. Now, after what we've learned up until now, it's very easy for us to understand that simple carbohydrates, that is monosaccharides and disaccharides, can be taken up into our bloodstream or absorbed very quickly after they enter our digestive system, as they either are already in their simplest form or they only need to be broken down in one simple step. And that's why simple carbohydrates or sugars raise our blood glucose levels rapidly, leading to what's often called a spike, quote unquote, in our blood glucose levels. And complex carbohydrates or polysaccharides or starches, on the other hand, they raise our blood glucose levels more slowly, as it takes our digestive system a longer time to break down these large glucose chains and branches. But that does, however, not mean that these foods don't raise the blood sugar as much. The blood glucose spike just doesn't happen as fast. So the speed of digestion of carbohydrates is determined by the chemistry of the carbohydrate, but it is also affected by a variety of other factors, such as which other nutrients are consumed together with the carbohydrate, or how the food is prepared, and also individual differences in metabolism. Now, as we now understand this, that when glucose is absorbed into our bloodstream, our blood glucose level or blood sugar level increases. Then we can introduce two more terms, which is the glycemic index and glycemic load. Now, these concepts have been developed to characterize how food behaves during human digestion, ranking carbohydrate-rich foods based on the rapidity and the magnitude of their effect on blood glucose levels. So glycemic index is a measure of how quickly glucose from food is absorbed, while glycemic load is a measure of the total absorbable glucose in foods. That is, how much of the glucose in the food is absorbable. Now, we will not place a big focus on this, but it is valuable to understand these concepts. So I'll explain them a little bit here now. So the glycemic index is a number from 0 to 100 with pure glucose given the value of 100, which represents the relative rise in blood glucose levels 2 hours after consuming that food. And the glycemic index of a specific food depends primarily on the quantity and the type of carbohydrate it contains, but it also is affected by the amount of entrapment of the carbohydrate molecules within the food. The fat and the protein content of the food, the amount of organic acids or the salts that's in the food, and also whether or how the food is cooked. So a food is considered to have a low GI or glycemic index if the glycemic index is 55 or less, and a high glycemic index if it is 70 or more, and then a mid-range if it's in between 56 and 69. But it's crucial to keep in mind that there are many limitations to the glycemic index. For example, depending on quantities, the number of grams of carbohydrate in a food can have a bigger impact on blood glucose levels than actually the glycemic index does. But with that being said, a low glycemic index food will cause a slower and more steady increase in blood glucose levels after a meal, while a high glycemic index food causes a more rapid rise in postprandial blood glucose levels. And you can find some charts of the glycemic index of different foods, but it's important to keep in mind that these charts often give only one value per food, but the glycemic index of the same type of food can vary depending on factors such as ripeness, where riper fruits contain more sugars and therefore have a higher GI. Cooking methods also. The more cooked or overcooked a food is, the more its cellular structure is broken, so it's digested more quickly and therefore raises blood glucose faster. Then processing, for example, flour has a higher GI than the whole grain from which flour is ground. And in addition, the glycemic response differs from one person to another, and also in the same person from day to day, depending on blood glucose levels, insulin resistance, and so forth. So the glycemic index only indicates the impact that a certain food has on the blood glucose levels in our body 2 hours after eating the food. But people with, for example, diabetes can have elevated blood glucose levels for up to 4 hours or longer after eating certain foods. Now, the glycemic load of a food is a number that estimates how much a food will raise a person's blood glucose levels after it is eaten, and it has nothing to do with how fast that happens. And 1 unit of glycemic load is the estimated effect of eating 1 gram of glucose. So GL estimates the impact of carbohydrate intake using the glycemic index, while taking also into account the amount of carbohydrates that are eaten in a serving. Whereas the glycemic index is defined for each type of food, glycemic load can be calculated for any size of serving of a food, or an entire meal, or an entire day's meal. For example, a watermelon has a high glycemic index, but a typical serving of watermelon does not contain many carbohydrates, so the GL or glycemic load of eating it is low. So glycemic load is not used much on a daily basis, but it's good to have heard of this concept as well as the glycemic index. Now, back to what happens in our body when glucose has been absorbed into our bloodstream. Now, the blood glucose level, or also talked about as blood sugar level, blood sugar concentration, or blood glucose concentration, or glycemia. This is the measure of glucose that is concentrated in our blood. That is how much glucose we have circulating in our bloodstream at some point in time. And this concentration of glucose in the bloodstream is tightly regulated as a part of a metabolic homeostasis, or balance. For example, a 70 kilogram human, or someone weighing 154 pounds, has approximately 4 grams of dissolved glucose maintained in the blood plasma at all times, called blood glucose. And glucose that is not circulating in the blood is stored in skeletal muscle and in liver cells in the form of glycogen. Remember, we talked about glycogen earlier. It's the polysaccharide that is the main storage form of glucose in the human body. Now, the glucose molecules that are circulating in our blood are used by our body cells. The glucose is constantly taken up into our cells to use for energy production. So the amount of glucose molecules in our bloodstream is always decreasing, and when we are awake, we continuously contribute more glucose to our bloodstream by, for example, eating. But during fasting, that is during a period of time when we're not getting food into our system, for example, when we sleep, then blood glucose is maintained at a constant level by 2 ways. Firstly, by releasing glucose from our glycogen stores in the liver, which is a process called glycogenolysis. And lysis means just breaking something down. So basically this means glycogen breakdown. And secondly, blood glucose is also maintained at a constant level by producing more glucose from other non-carbohydrate sources like lactic acid, glycerol, and amino acids from protein. And this process is called gluconeogenesis. Genesis means formation and neo means new. So the word basically means just glucose new formation. Now, in humans, proper blood glucose homeostasis or balance is crucial for normal function of our cells. Heart cells, brain cells, kidney cells, etc. The brain, for example, consumes approximately 60% of blood glucose in fasting sedentary individuals. So glucose is the main and essential metabolic fuel for the brain, like we've talked about in our last episode. And acute and severe reduction of brain glucose leads quickly to impairment of cognitive and reflex function, autonomic failure, seizure, loss of consciousness, and then permanent and irreversible brain damage, if it is not rapidly corrected, can be lethal. So it's really important for our body to have good access to glucose at all times. Now, 2 terms we need to be familiar with moving forward is abnormal persistently high glycemia or high blood glucose levels. That's called hyperglycemia. And low levels are referred to as hypoglycemia. And diabetes is the most prominent disease that is related to the failure of blood glucose regulation. And it is characterized by persistent hyperglycemia, high blood glucose, from a variety of causes. Now, note here that I say that it's characterized by persistent hyperglycemia. That does not mean that it is caused by this. And we'll talk about this more in detail later. Now, before we go any further, it is also good to be familiar with how blood glucose levels are measured. So blood glucose levels are measured in two ways, either as mass concentration in milligrams per deciliter of blood, and this measurement is used in the US, for example, or as molar concentration in millimoles per liter, which is a measurement used in the UK, Australia, Canada, and many other countries in Europe. Now, 1 millimole per liter of glucose is equivalent to 18 milligrams per deciliter. And in this podcast, I will mostly be using the millimole per liter measurement, but I'll always try to specify the other measurement as well. Now, our blood glucose levels, they do fluctuate throughout the day, but for a healthy individual with a normally operating glucose homeostasis or glucose balance, the blood glucose levels are typically restored to a range of about 4.4 to 6.1 millimole per liter, or 79 to 110 milligrams per deciliter. And according to the National Institutes of Health, blood glucose levels for those without diabetes and who are not fasting should be below 6.9 millimoles, or 125 milligrams per deciliter. But for standard evaluation in blood glucose levels, we use a fasting blood glucose test. You may have heard of that before, meaning that we measure the blood glucose concentration after 8 to 12 hours of fasting. Now, healthy fasting blood glucose levels for adults is defined as blood glucose between 4.0 and 5.4 millimole per liter, or 70 to 99 milligrams per deciliter. Pre-diabetes is then defined as fasting blood glucose levels between 5.5 to 6.9, or 100 to 125 milligrams per deciliter. And anything above 7.0 or above 126 milligrams per deciliter indicates diabetes. Now, back to what happens in our body when we eat a meal with carbohydrates. So when the glucose molecules are taken up and enter our bloodstream, the amount of glucose in the blood obviously increases. That is, the concentration of glucose in the blood increases, so that blood glucose levels rise. And depending on several factors that we learned about earlier, this rise in blood glucose levels can happen quickly, causing a quote-unquote spike in blood glucose levels. A blood glucose spike is, like I talked about before, a rapid increase in blood sugar levels. Or it can happen more slowly, more gradually. And increased blood glucose level is called hyperglycemia. And when there is excess glucose in our bloodstream, the glucose is either used immediately by our cells for energy production, or it's put into storage. Now, hyperglycemia, or high blood glucose levels, triggers the secretion of the hormone insulin from the pancreas. Now, insulin is an anabolic hormone produced in the pancreas, and like we talked about in our first episode, anabolism is the building up aspect of metabolism. So, after a meal, our body secretes insulin in response to the elevated blood glucose levels. And insulin connects to glucose channels on our body's cells and then open them up. So the glucose that's in the blood moves from the bloodstream and into the cells and can then be used by the cells to produce energy, or to put it in storage as glycogen in liver cells or skeletal muscle cells. Or it can also be converted by liver cells to fatty acids for longer term storage in fat cells. And this is how the blood glucose levels go down again, because insulin increases and opens up the glucose channels on the cells so that glucose molecules flow from the bloodstream and into the cells. Now, depending on the size of the meal that we just had, this process often takes about 2 to 3 hours for healthy individuals. Now, when we are in need of glucose but do not get it from the digestive system, for example during fasting throughout the night, the body goes into a catabolic state. Catabolism is the breaking down aspect of metabolism. And in a state of low blood glucose levels, the pancreas secretes another hormone, which is called glucagon, which informs the tissues to release glucose from the glycogen storage in the liver, and for the liver to make more glucose from other non-carbohydrate sources. And other catabolic hormones in our body are cortisol, the best known stress hormone, and catecholamines such as dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. the main one here being epinephrine, also known as adrenaline. And these hormones are all stress-related hormones. These are stress hormones. So basically, the primary mechanism of glucose homeostasis in our body, or glucose balance in our body, is the secretion of insulin and glucagon into the blood in response to the blood glucose concentration. That is, insulin is secreted when blood glucose concentration increases from its baseline, and glucagon is secreted when the blood glucose levels or concentration decreases. And then also the secretion of the other stress hormones in addition to glucagon in low carbohydrate states or low glucose states, when the body is in need of the release of glucose from stores and production of glucose from other sources. So we have a balance here between a catabolic state, the breaking down aspect of metabolism, which is stress hormone driven, and an anabolic state, the building up aspect of metabolism, which is insulin driven. And these hormones also respond to each other. That is, insulin and glucagon, along with the stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, they do interact and respond to each other in complex ways to maintain blood glucose balance. For example, when blood glucose levels rise, such as after eating, beta cells in the pancreas release insulin. Insulin enhances glucose uptake by our body's cells and promote the storage of glucose as glycogen in the liver and muscle, thereby causing a decrease in blood glucose levels. And in addition, insulin also inhibits the breakdown of tissues, for example, fat in adipose tissue. However, when blood glucose levels fall, alpha cells in the pancreas secrete the hormone glucagon, which acts primarily on the liver to stimulate the breakdown of glycogen into glucose. And this process is called glycogenolysis. Lysis meaning breakdown. Glycogen is just glycogen, so the breakdown of glycogen. And it also stimulates the formation of glucose from amino acids and other substrates, which is a process called gluconeogenesis, glucose new formation. So insulin is secreted in response to increased levels of glucose in the blood and causes a decrease in blood glucose, while glucagon is secreted when blood glucose concentration decreases and causes an increase in blood glucose levels again. Now, regarding the interactions between insulin and glucagon, when insulin is high, it directly suppresses the secretion of glucagon from alpha cells. And this inhibition is important because it prevents the liver from releasing more glucose into the blood, which would otherwise exacerbate high blood sugar levels. And conversely, low insulin levels, as seen in fasting or type 1 diabetes, can lead to increased glucagon secretion. And this increase helps raise blood glucose levels by stimulating liver glucose output. Regarding the other stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, these hormones are released by the adrenal glands during stress. Whether it's physical stress, emotional stress, or metabolic stress like hypoglycemia, that is low blood sugar, both cortisol and adrenaline work to increase blood glucose levels. And this makes sense because in any stressful situation, our body cells need to have access to energy sources, to fuel, so that they can produce energy fast and easily. And that's why we have to have enough glucose available in the bloodstream at all times. Now, cortisol increases blood glucose levels by enhancing gluconeogenesis, the formation of new glucose molecules, and by decreasing the sensitivity of peripheral tissues to insulin, meaning cortisol makes the body cells less sensitive to insulin, so that the glucose channels on these cells don't open up as easily, and less glucose is therefore taken up from the bloodstream and into the cells. So then we have more glucose in the bloodstream. Now, adrenaline increases glucose levels by stimulating glycogenolysis, that is the breakdown of glycogen into glucose, and lipolysis, the breakdown of lipids or fats, specifically triglycerides stored in fat cells, into glycerol and free fatty acids that can be used as fuel for energy production. And it also decreases the secretion of insulin from the pancreas. So basically, there are three main hormones that cause an increase in blood glucose levels in our body, and these are glucagon and the two stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline. And then we have insulin, which causes a decrease in blood glucose levels. Now, We need to pause here a little bit and get technical. And the reason why I will go so deep into this right here is the same as in the last, I mentioned in our last episode, is because when we understand the foundation of things, we are much more likely to make changes to our lifestyle if we need, and number 2, maintain healthy habits. So we will now look at how blood sugar relates to energy on a cellular level. And like we talked about in our first episode, our body is made up of cells, and each cell is a tiny little organism that produces energy. And all our body cells need fuel to produce energy in order to function and keep us alive. And most cells can use both glucose from carbohydrates and fatty acids from fat for fuel. But neural cells, for example, the cells in our brain and nervous system, they can only use glucose. Also ketones, but we will get into that in a later episode. Now, our brain is the most energy demanding organ in our body, and it uses approximately 60% of available glucose in when we're in a sedentary state. So glucose, that we've talked about, is transported to our body cells by our blood. So the blood glucose levels or blood sugar level is therefore a measure of how much fuel we have available for immediate use at any given point. Or in other words, the amount of immediate energy that our body can produce at any given point in time, given that the energy production process works seamlessly. Now, if the blood glucose level is high, then our body has a lot of fuel available, but if it is low, then our body does not have a lot of immediate available fuel. And this can affect the production of energy. And as our brain is a critical organ for the function and survival of our whole body, it is very important that the brain has adequate amount of fuel available at all times. And therefore, maintaining appropriate blood glucose levels is extremely important, so that the brain always has available fuel to produce energy. It is an everlasting battle for our body to keep the blood glucose levels up, to maintain an adequate amount of fuel available, because the glucose is used constantly, and therefore the blood glucose levels keep dropping. The brain is always active and always taking up glucose, along with other organs, of course, but the brain is the biggest glucose utilizer. So the brain is constantly taking up glucose from the bloodstream, causing a decrease in blood glucose levels over time. And when our brain is highly active, or other parts of our body for that matter, such as our muscles during exercising, the blood glucose levels fall much faster. And if the blood glucose concentration falls too much, then our brain won't have sufficient fuel and will start shutting off. Our body reacts to the decreasing levels in blood glucose in many ways, and you may notice it as maybe first you start feeling hungry, irritated, weak, angry, nervous, anxious, jittery, hot or clammy. And in addition, we will also have trouble concentrating and a lack of willpower. And these symptoms have a purpose to reduce our body's usage of blood glucose and encourage us to go find food to eat, which would then raise our blood glucose levels again in the most easy way. And in addition to this, the low blood glucose levels also activate our stress systems, like we've talked about. The hormone glucagon and along with adrenaline are released first to increase the concentration of glucose in the blood by breaking down glycogen stored in liver, remember the glucose storage. And they also switch the body's primary fuel from glucose to fatty acids to conserve the little glucose that the body does have for the brain. Then if these hormones can't raise the blood glucose levels enough, either because the glycogen stores are getting empty or because the body uses the available glucose up too quickly, then the stress hormone cortisol is released. And cortisol leads to the breakdown of protein, especially from our muscles, but also from other organs and other tissues containing protein. And protein is broken down into amino acids, which are then used for glucose production through a process called gluconeogenesis, like we talked about earlier, glucose new formation. And this is our body's last resort to raise blood glucose levels and supply energy. So to sum this up, our body's primary fuel that it uses to produce energy in order for every cell in our body to function and be alive is glucose. And when our body is low on fuel, for example in a fasted state during the night, it turns on its stress hormones, glucagon, adrenaline, and eventually cortisol to provide the body with fuel. That is, they all aim to increase blood glucose levels by the release of glucose from storage, the formation of glucose from other non-carbohydrate sources, and by promoting the release of fatty acids from fat stores to be used as an energy source in the cells that can use fatty acids instead of glucose, and thereby sparing the glucose for the most important tissues, like the brain, which cannot use fatty acids. So being in a fasted state means that our body's stress levels are elevated, and having a low blood sugar increases our stress levels, our stress hormones, in order to provide glucose for energy. Now, the relationship between elevated stress hormones and health in general is very well known in the health community, as it is well known that the stress hormones glucagon and cortisol are involved in the development of diseases like type 2 diabetes, and also that cortisol is immunosuppressive and implicated in states such as obesity, heart disease, osteoporosis, depression, and many other chronic diseases. So it makes sense that our aim, if we want to avoid diseases and have good health, should be to minimize the stress hormone-driven state as much as we can. Now, this right here, like I just said, is well known in the health community, that increased levels of these stress hormones for a prolonged period of time plays a role in the development of many diseases, but it is not as well recognized that, or not as much talked about, that this connection here in relation to blood glucose regulation, that is, these are the same hormones that work to increase blood glucose levels when blood glucose is low, but in today's society there's much more emphasis on keeping the blood glucose levels and insulin levels down, as for people with, for example, metabolic disorders like type 2 diabetes have persistently high blood glucose levels and high insulin levels, so that must be bad, and that's often looked at as the driver of the disease and must be bad. So we must do all we can to keep blood glucose levels low and insulin levels low as well. So that often leads to dietary methods that involve restricting carbohydrates, which only actually leads to our body switching on the stress hormone-driven state to provide glucose to the bloodstream by itself, meaning that we are upregulating stress hormones that are known to cause many health problems and diseases, or other methods like prolonged fasts, which also upregulate the stress hormone-driven state to maintain blood glucose levels, and so forth. So when we think about it this way, blood glucose levels have an inverse relationship with stress, meaning that when blood glucose is low, the release of stress hormones increases, and when blood glucose is high, our body reduces the release of stress hormones. However, everyone knows that in people with insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, high blood glucose levels are common, and that is often blamed for the damage that goes on for creating and driving the disease by causing and driving high amounts of insulin in the blood, both of which are talked about as causing and driving insulin resistance. But in these conditions, the stress hormones are also elevated. After what we've just talked about earlier about insulin and the stress hormones responding to one another, how come that the stress hormones are also elevated in conditions like insulin resistance and eventually type 2 diabetes, where blood glucose levels and insulin levels are also high? The problem in these conditions isn't that the blood glucose is high. If that was the problem, the driver of the problem, then the stress hormones should actually not be high as well. So the high blood glucose is just a symptom of an underlying condition, an underlying problem or malfunction. Because as we've just learned, the stress hormones are secreted as an answer to low blood glucose levels. But in insulin resistance and diabetes, the blood glucose levels are high and the stress hormones are also high. And this leads us to insulin resistance, which we will talk about in part 2 of this blood glucose series. Thanks for tuning into this episode. If you're looking for more information or want to check out any studies I reference, head on to my website, babyletsmove.com. You can also join me for a workout through my app called Baby Let's Move, available in both App Store and Google Play. And don't forget to connect with me on Instagram and YouTube for even more content. If you enjoyed today's show, please consider giving it a 5-star rating or a like and share it with a friend. It really helps me reach more amazing listeners like you. Until next time, keep moving and stay healthy.